Hey there, it's Ben Housel here, and here in this beginner tutorial we're going to be having a look at the interface in Final Cut Pro 10. Now if you want to find some of the tools in Final Cut Pro 10, this is going to be really useful for you, such as the waveforms if you're doing color correction or looking for things like the inspector if you can't find it when you're working in Final Cut Pro 10 for changing things like the scale and rotation of clips. This is going to be really useful. There's also going to be some useful tips in here for things that pop up in the interface when you accidentally hit the wrong shortcut. So we're going to run through some of the things that have popped up in people's questions over the years that I've been working with Final Cut Pro 10 and basically help you to get the interface back to how you want to work with it or to add other elements into the interface. If you like these tips and tricks in Final Cut Pro 10, then please do hit the subscribe button and the notifications button. I create tutorials and tutorial reviews of different kind of plugins and products of Final Cut Pro 10 and I'm trying to post weekly. It doesn't always happen, but without further ado, let's dive into this tutorial on working with the Final Cut Pro 10 interface. So the first interface tip is about what happens when you see a completely empty interface. Now this can happen in Final Cut Pro 10, and for some who are new to Final Cut Pro 10, it may seem like your videos have just disappeared. They haven't. The libraries are stored wherever you saved them. So to set up a new library and to kind of bring the interface to life, we either need to go to File and Open Library to open up a recent library that we've worked with, or we can create something brand new. So we're going to open up this Costa Azul library, and basically as soon as you have a library open, then you'll see your clips up on the top left normally, and then your library listed on the left hand side. Now talking about libraries and that empty interface, it's often a good idea to keep fewer libraries open rather than more. So look for this little icon with 4 stars and 4 boxes in it, and if you've got lots of these open along the left, then as Final Cut Pro opens, it's going to take a long time to kind of open up all those different libraries or library projects as you're beginning to open Final Cut Pro 10. It can also mean you could accidentally import things into the wrong library as well. So I tend to try and keep only 1 library or 2 libraries open at a time. If you right click on any one of these libraries, you can close it. Doesn't mean it's disappeared, it just means that it's not open. So the next thing about the interface in Final Cut Pro 10 is resetting the layout. So oftentimes if you're missing part of the interface and you've closed a panel, then the easiest way to get those panels back, and this is the same for Final Cut Pro, for Photoshop, for lots of different applications, is that you can reset the workspace layout. So if we go to Window, Workspaces and Default, you can see we can jump back to that default layout, which is pretty much where we're at already anyway, but that's a useful one to know. So for instance, there are ways in which we can do things like hide the timeline, where we can hide the sidebars and stuff like that, and Final Cut Pro is really going to start to look like there's lots of the useful tools that we need to edit that are missing. So if we go to Window, Workspaces and Default, it's going to bring all those different elements back and we can edit away. So that's my number 2 tip for the interface in Final Cut Pro 10. My next tip is also about showing and hiding different parts of the interface as well. So if we come up to this top right hand side of our screen, we can see we have these 3 buttons for showing and hiding different parts of the interface. Now, when you're working on a high-res screen, you don't often need extra space on your screen to edit, but if you're working on a smaller laptop, then sometimes hiding things like the inspector, which we can do by clicking this button, or hiding the libraries on the left, which we can do by clicking this button, are useful things to do. It means now we're focusing on the timeline and the edits that we're playing back up here in our viewer. So we can show and hide these different library and inspector elements by clicking these 3 buttons at the top right. We can also, as we saw before as well, go to Window, Show in Workspace, and show and hide those inspector and sidebar and browser elements by using those menu items as well. Now what you'll notice in all your menus is that we have shortcuts next to those menus as well, and those are useful to begin to remember some of those as you go through. So wherever you have a function in a menu, you'll normally see a shortcut next to it if it's assigned to it. So my 4th tip for the interface of Final Cut Pro 10 is about how we navigate these libraries up on the top left. Now we have our libraries, our audio and photos, and our generators and text up here as well. But in the libraries in particular, when we're looking at this, we have this little speech bubble film icon button up here that allows us to zoom in and zoom out of those library items in different ways. So here we're showing this kind of big film strip of everything in that library, which can be a bit confusing. It can sometimes feel like there's a bit too much stuff in there when you're zoomed right out. So I would often recommend just coming up here and zooming this all the way to the left so you just see the thumbnails, and then getting that clip height to the point where you're happy with kind of what you're seeing on screen. And learning how to manage kind of how you view your libraries is really going to help you navigate your media a lot more quickly. There are also some options as well within the libraries for viewing things as a list and as thumbnails as well. So oftentimes when we're clicking around, we might flip to the list by accident and then wonder how we get back to those thumbnails. And this is the button up at the top, just to the left, that we can use to kind of flip between those different icons. My fifth tip for the interface in Final Cut Pro 10 is where we find our text and graphic generators. So we have our text and graphic generators up here again at the top left. So you can see we have all our different titles up here and all of our different generators. And oftentimes when you come to these types of menus, you'll see a little arrow to the left that will allow you to expand and contract different aspects of the interface that you're interacting with. So here we can expand out the titles, we can come into our basic build in and build out titles, and then as we move through these we can hover across to kind of get a little preview of those as well. So this is where we find our titles and generators in Final Cut Pro 10. And titles are all about the text, and generators are all about things that you can generate. So solid colors, different elements that you can use in Final Cut Pro 10, like shapes and stuff like that. So this is where you would come to find those different elements. So I'm just going to come back to my libraries here. Now, the next most useful thing in the interface is the inspector, which we briefly mentioned before when we're turning it on and off. Now in the inspector, we can see information about anything that we have selected in Final Cut Pro 10. At the moment, I have my library selected, so up at the top left, I have my Costa Azul library selected. So we can see a whole bunch of useful information up at the top right, such as the library size. So for instance, if your hard drive is getting full, you want to see how big the library you're working on is. You can find that information up here. We can also consolidate media up here as well and do some kind of more advanced techniques for where we're actually storing our imported footage and stuff like that. So we don't need to worry too much about that, but the inspector is where we would find some of those storage location settings for our libraries, but also for any clip or anything that we have selected. So if we select a clip on the timeline, this is where we come to actually modify elements of that clip. So we can modify things like the scale in the inspector, the rotation, we can animate elements and stuff like that. So this inspector that we see up at the top right is super useful. It's also useful for titles as well. So if we're working with titles in our edits, this inspector at the top right is also where we'll come to modify the text, to change properties of those titles, and also to do things like color correction and stuff like that on our video. So if we click on a clip here, you can see this little triangle brings us to the color correction option. So the inspector has a huge amount of useful information in there, but also a lot of control that you can apply to your videos once you've got them down in your timeline. It will also show you information of the clips in the library as well. So when we select clips here, we can view the info for those clips. So for instance, if you're having resolution issues or frame rate issues, you might check the resolution and frame rate of your original clips to check that you've got the kind of right clips imported or that they're at the resolution you were expecting. So the inspector is super useful. Again, we can come to Window, Show in Workspace, and Show and Hide the inspector as well. And Command and 4 is a shortcut for that, which will toggle it on and off, make it visible or invisible. So my next tip for Final Cut Pro 10, but specifically to do with things that have disappeared. So we mentioned before that in our window menu, and we can hide things like the sidebar, we can hide things like the timeline, and also we can hide things like the inspector as well. So we can make our screen look very different here as well. So knowing those shortcuts for things like the timeline, so Control, Command and 2 to bring the timeline back up, Command and 4 to bring the inspector back up, those shortcuts for actually navigating between those windows is going to be super useful for you. So up here at the top left, if we do Control, Command and 1, we're going to hide the libraries and we're going to show the libraries as well. And we've also got shortcuts for showing the sidebar as well. So Command and the accent as well will show our libraries and hide our libraries. So again, lots of different ways in which we're able to modify our workspace. So learning some of these shortcuts will be useful to help you work fluidly with the interface and to kind of know where everything is. My next tip for the interface is about zooming. So if we come to the middle window here and we zoom in, we see a little red box here. I see this question pop up a lot on different forums in Final Cut Pro 10. Basically, if you see this red box, you're zoomed in. And if we go to fit here, we're zooming to fit. So basically, this isn't an interface issue. It's actually helping you to look close up at your video. So where this is really useful is the 100% view, because this means that we're looking at our video at 100%, so we can see how crisp it is, how sharp the edges are, and how good quality the kind of video is that we've shot. So if we go to 100% here, you can see the kind of quality of the video and whether it's good for kind of what we're broadcasting it out as. So the 100% view is useful. It brings up this little red box, but if we come back to fit, it will take us back. And we can also do Shift and Z, and that will zoom to fit as well. Shift and Z will work in two places. It will work in the timeline if we're zoomed in, to zoom to fit the timeline, and it will also work up here to zoom to fit. So Shift and Z will zoom to fit, and actually it will also work up in the library as well. So if I'm zoomed in my library, you can see I'm using Command plus there to zoom in. I can use Shift and Z to bring everything back to that thumbnail view, which is super handy. So for the 8th tip here, we've just jumped back to the default layout by going to Window, Workspaces and checking Default. And this tip is about measuring either your audio levels or working with color correction in Final Cut Pro 10. So as we mentioned before, with color correction, if we want to make the color corrections, we go into the inspector. But really importantly, when we're making any color corrections or audio adjustments, we need to measure what we're doing. So if you come to View and Video Scopes, this will show you the video scope. So we have a few different video scopes we can use in Final Cut Pro 10. Here we're looking at the waveform. If we jump down here, we can see the different kind of parades and vector scopes and histograms that we can work with. And these will be useful for measuring the saturation of your images and also how light or dark your images are. So we have the histogram, which you'll recognize if you ever used Photoshop, where we're measuring from the darkest part of the image through to the lightest part of the image, the reds, greens and blues. And then also we can change that too, so we can have an RGB parade so we can see that red, green and blue independently. And then in our vector scope we have the saturation of the image, so we can measure when we're making color adjustments where the color is kind of pointing towards and how much color there is. And learning about these tools is well worthwhile investing some time in when you're working with Final Cut Pro. And then the waveform as well, which measures the lightness and darkness. So for instance, if we quickly come across the color correction here and exposure, you can see we can darken or lighten the image, but as we're doing that, we're really measuring where that color is going. So if we increase the contrast here by making the blacks blacker and the whites lighter, we get that kind of really contrasty style image. We can kind of see what's happening to the colors in that image. So I've got other videos on color correction that are really worthwhile kind of taking a look at, and exploring other tutorials on color correction is definitely worth spending some time invested in. If we go back to the view menu, we can hide the video scopes, and Command and 7 is the shortcut for toggling them on and off. And then the other thing that you'll want to measure all the time as you're editing any audio is the audio monitors here. Now, when we click on this little button in the middle, just to the right of the timecode, it brings up the audio monitors. But if we come to the right and just stretch that out, we get a larger audio monitor view. And what that also means, I'm just going to push the sound up here so we can kind of see something reading in there, is when we get any peaks in our audio, it's going to show us how much the audio has peaked by. So if I just push this up all the way to the top, you can see here the left and right audio channels are peaking at around 7, so I know now that I need to make an adjustment of at least -7 to my audio levels as I'm working in Final Cut Pro 10. So the audio levels on the video scope are super important things to know how to bring up in the interface in Final Cut Pro 10. The number 9 tip that I have here is all about the timecode. So basically when we're editing, we need to keep an eye on the timecode in our interface. So where we are in our clip, and that is right up here in the middle of our screen. So the timecode here highlights that I'm at 11 seconds and 23 frames in my clip. If I highlight a clip, it's going to show me the timecode of where I'm at, but also this little selection here. So I'm got 1 second and 21 frames selected of this clip over the whole 23 seconds of this entire edit. So keeping an eye out for the timecode, your selection timecode, and also the duration of your overall project here is going to be really handy. And just kind of gradually educating yourself about the hours, minutes, seconds, and frames that you're seeing up there will help you to kind of keep a handle on your edit and to keep your edit flowing nicely. So you can see as we scrub through here, we see the timecode for the timeline. And then if we hover over clips up at the top left, we see up here the timecode of the clip. So the timecode is super useful in any editing that you're doing in Final Cut Pro 10. So moving on to the very last tip for working in Final Cut Pro 10 and kind of managing the interface, knowing where everything is, and that is the help menu. So we're not actually going to look at the specific kind of help items here. It's this search that is super useful. So for instance, if we're missing things or we forget which menu we go to find the inspector or something like that, then we can type in things like inspector up here, and it will show us in Final Cut Pro or in any Mac application where we can find those items in the menu. So you can see I've got my option showing workspace inspector. It's showing me to go to the window showing workspace and inspector option, and that's where I can find that. So for instance, if we lose or forget any different kind of menu items here, then we can go to the search and we can find those. So if we want to look for different copy options, we can find different copy options. So you can see you can copy keyframes here, which is super useful to know. We can copy timecode, we can copy an entire clip, and then we can also do things like copy to library. So we can see different options that we have in Final Cut Pro 10 by searching in this menu, and also find things when we forget where they are or when we forget the shortcut. So that's a quick overview of the interface in Final Cut Pro 10. Always super useful to kind of know how to move around fluidly and to know where things are. If you have any questions about Final Cut Pro 10, then do leave them in the comments below. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you on the next tutorial.